This event is really inspired by a wider project that myself, Harry and Lewis are involved with, which is called Education at a Time of Emergency. And the Conversations at a Time of Emergency is connected to and sponsored by the Economic and Social Research Council Festival of Social Science, which is occurring in November. And that essentially is designed to be a showcase of the ways in which social science research provides major contributions to UK society, the economy, and I guess from the perspective of all of us on this call, to the environment and the environmental issues that we all care so deeply about. So Education at a Time of Emergency is a project that the three of us are leading, which started about a month ago, and it will run until the first half of 2022. And it's essentially about working with a series of partners in the southwest of England who deliver all sorts of different kinds of educational and engagement experiences on the environment and climate change. And our role is really to work with them to share knowledge about the ways in which different approaches from the social sciences can be deployed to promote behavioural change. And we've got a fantastic set of partners that we're working with. I haven't got time to name all of them now, but one of our key partners at the national scale is the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Climate Change, and we're hoping that will promote our work at the national scale. What we're intending to do is work with our partners to share knowledge, but particularly expertise in behavioural change through a set of mentoring and training programmes, and of course the development of resources. And this emerges from a kind of broader scale of engagement that we've had over many years now through people like Harry and Lewis and a PhD candidate who we also worked with, Susan Warren, with a range of partners, but in particular the Wild Planet Trust that runs Paignton Zoo, the Wildlife Trusts in the Southwest, and of course the Field Studies Council. We've held a number of workshops with a range of practitioners on environmental education over the years. And the really interesting thing that comes out from those workshops is that people are really passionate about wanting to do environmental education well, to do it differently, to do it innovatively, and also to do it using the latest social science research on behaviour change. Because we all recognise that the kind of simplistic approaches that are frequently rolled out, you know, we might look at the current COVID crisis and see the kind of very simplistic assumptions that are made about information deficits and communication. We know that behaviour change and engaging with a range of publics using different kinds of knowledge and different framings of knowledge, that's actually very complex. And so what the Education at the Time of Emergency project is seeking to do is to try and work with partners to work through that complexity and to provide them with practical mentoring-based strategies to change what they do. And so we've organised that whole research programme, and indeed this evening, around three core themes that are really central to what we want to do. The first of these is connection. So thinking about the relationships that we have with nature and with other human beings, to think about our empathy when we're working with others and the ways in which we can understand others' positions. And thirdly, understanding. Delving deeper into various different knowledge bases that we have. So it's about awareness, as you know, our self-awareness and our connection with others and in the environment. Secondly, we thought long and hard about whether to use this word or not. We did use it because we think it's important, it's a well-known word, but communication. Now, we don't mean that in a didactic sense, a traditional sense, but thinking about how we engage with others to co-construct different kinds of knowledge about the environment and environmental change, to recognise how we frame particular issues like climate change in certain ways, and we're going to hear about that later, to think about how we narrate, how we write about, how we illustrate, how we visualize different kinds of knowledge and the effect that that has on the way that people receive and understand it. And then finally, of course, agency. How we engage, how we empower, and how we choose to act. So that kind of led us for this evening to these 3 questions that you'll have seen on the advertisement for tonight's event, which as a group of people, we don't know everybody's background who's here tonight, but you know, many of us will be educators in the very, very broadest of senses. We might be working in a community group seeking to engage people with a community composting program. We might be somebody who works in a school. We might be somebody who teaches environmental science at university. Whatever it is, how might we make our work more effective in developing pro-environmental practices in the climate and environment emergency? How do we work with young people in particular at a time of climate and environment emergency? And then what strategies do we use to reach more people and to reach them meaningfully, thinking about those ideas of engagement, empowerment, and action? And we really want to stress tonight that we're going to hear 3 really inspiring talks from different perspectives. Not all of our speakers are experts in education, but they bring particular expertise on engagement, on framing, on behavior change more broadly. And our job, I think, as kind of the audience, is to think, how can we apply these ideas in this very broad educational context? So what's going to happen is I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, as Harry outlined. They will speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and we'll then move on to the next speaker. So we'll have the 3 speakers in a row. And at that point, we will then open it up for questions. And we're going to manage that process. So if you do have a question, write it in the Q&A. And it will be the job of me, Lewis, and Harry to select the questions to ask. And remember that you can vote for particular questions. If you like a question, you don't want to type it out again, you can vote for that. So we'll try and get as many of those in as possible before we need to end at 7:30. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Tom. Now, all the speaker biographies you'll hopefully have read. I won't read all of them out again, but Tom Crompton is the director of the Common Cause Foundation. And I think what's interesting, Tom, you kind of have a natural science background, but you've spent about the last 15 years working on values and social change. And certainly for me, the piece of work that influenced my work so much, I think you published in 2009 with John Ferguson on spillovers and a critique of that kind of approach. And you've done a lot of work with governments and with other academics globally. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Stewart, for that very generous introduction. So my contribution, I think, was going to be to invite us to situate these reflections on education at a time of emergency on as broad a canvas as possible. And in particular, I was going to invite us to think not just about the content of education, but our shared understanding of the purpose of education. What is it that education is for? And in that, I'm going to draw in particular on some of the thinking which is as relevant today, I think, as it was when it was first published in 1994, of David Orr in this book, Earth in Mind, which I think is makes a compelling case for a re-examination of our understanding of the purpose of education. And I'd suggest that increasingly, perhaps, we've come to see education as a means to achieve qualifications and as a means to employment and to making a living, and that as that perspective on education has strengthened, we've lost something collectively in terms of our understanding and celebration of education as a means for knowing the world better, understanding our place in the world and our connection to others better, perhaps deepening our sense of wonder at the world. So in a sense, I want to suggest that our understanding of education and the purpose of education has been hollowed out. It's been victim of the kind of a neoliberalization of education, which has had a similar impact on so many other sectors. And the lens through which I wanted to explore those issues in the next few minutes was the lens offered by a social psychologist's understanding of cultural values. As Stewart said, I'm not a social psychologist, although I've worked in close collaboration with social psychologists over the last 10 or maybe 15 years now. And we draw in particular on a model of values very well understood and researched model of values developed by an Israeli social psychologist, a guy called Shalom Schwartz. A social psychologist's understanding of values is perhaps a little bit different to our understanding of what values are in the vernacular. So we might think of values as being kind of moral standards. From a social psychologist perspective, they're a bit broader than that. They're standards or principles that we carry through life, which inform our attitudes and behaviors. Certainly don't determine them, but help to shape them, and include certainly those things that we might think associate with kind of moral fiber, honesty, for example, or trustworthiness, but also include a wide range of other standards or principles, including perhaps our desire for social status or public image or financial wealth, or our need for security, or our appetite for pleasure seeking and hedonism. So I'm going to share with you a cross section of a person's head showing these values. Can I have a thumbs up from one of my co-presenters? Thank you, Harry. So you can see that. So I'm inviting you to imagine that each of these balloons represents a group of values that in some psychological sense cohere. So perhaps the blue balloon represents a group of values associated with health and security and safety. And those cohere, by which I mean that if you attach importance to one of those values, you're likely to prioritize others of them. The red balloon perhaps represents a group of values related to hedonism and pleasure seeking and enjoyment in life. Again, a set of values that cohere. But I want to draw your attention. Oh, well, actually, before I do I lost my cursor? Oh, there we go. Just before I do, I just want to mention in passing this. Many of you will be familiar with what's sometimes called the value action gap, or the observation that actually we may hold certain values, but don't actually our behaviors or attitudes aren't necessarily aligned with the values we say we attach greatest importance to, and that's certainly the case. But as one of our collaborators at Bath, Greg Mayo, would argue, as you begin to aggregate across behaviors and begin to look at, in aggregate at a person's social or environmental concern, rather than their adherence to specific behaviors, that link between values and aggregate social and environmental concern strengthens until values become actually one of the, if not the most important predictor of a person's overall social or environmental concern. So I want to focus in particular on two of those balloons, represented here by the green and the purple. The purple balloon here represents a set of values that I'm going to call extrinsic. So these are values, again, that cohere as a group. They include values of a desire for financial wealth or social status. They're probably related to our urge to compete with others and to excel relative to others. And I want to show you what happens to the importance that we attach to those extrinsic values when we encounter certain cues or stimuli in the wider social surround, the wider social environment. And as my example, I'm going to choose this framing of higher education. Higher education framed in terms of the opportunity it presents to secure a highly remunerative job, a frame of higher education, I think with which many of us are familiar. Looking at that image and the text associated with that image will have engaged in you your extrinsic values, and will have led to what I'm representing in this cartoon fashion here as a ballooning, as a strengthening, temporarily, of course, of your extrinsic values. But look at that again, because as the importance you attach to those extrinsic values temporarily increases, they're crowding out values represented here by the green balloon. And those are values that I'm going to call intrinsic values. They have to do with our concern both for people with whom we're in frequent contact, our in-group, our friends, family and community and compatriots, but also out-groups, other human beings, and indeed other living beings, other species. And so there's this antagonistic relationship, such that in engaging extrinsic values, we, in the language of the social psychologists, we crowd out the intrinsic values, suppressing temporarily the importance that we place on those values, and that has predictable attitudinal and behavioral outcomes. So as a result, we know of showing people photographs of desirable consumer items, of referring to people as consumers rather than citizens, or of a raft of ways of cueing extrinsic values. We know that that has a tendency to suppress or diminish a person's expression of a range of social environment and environmental, pro-social and pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors. So there's this kind of seesaw relationship between intrinsic and extrinsic values. There's one more piece just before I finish, which is that whilst that effect happens temporarily, what we know is that repeated engagement with values strengthens them. Michael Sandel related values to muscles that strengthen with repeated exercise. So we know, for example, there's a study was done in the US that looked at how undergraduates' values changed over the course of an undergraduate degree, and compared the shift in students' values in amongst astronomy majors and law majors. And at point of matriculation, it was found that on average, people who were undertaking law degrees tended to place relatively greater importance on intrinsic values, perhaps because they were drawn to law as a subject because they had a sense of social purpose and how they might use a law degree for wider social good. But over the course of their law course, relative to astronomy students, the importance they placed on intrinsic values diminished and the importance they placed on extrinsic increased. Perhaps, the researchers speculate, because of intensive grading pressures and competition in a law course, which are perhaps more intensive than was experienced by their fellow students on the astronomy course. What I'm suggesting is that over the course of time, repeatedly engaging values tends to have the effect of strengthening them in a more durable way. And that as we come to think and talk collectively about the purpose of education, as we shape collectively our understanding of what education is for and what we expect as individuals to get out of education, if that's framed in extrinsic terms, then it's likely to have a more durable effect in terms of elevating the importance we place on those extrinsic values, and diminishing now in a more durable way the importance we place on intrinsic values associated with more systemic social and environmental concern. I'm going to leave you with this picture to try to undo the priming that I imposed on you with the earlier image, drawing attention to the money that undergraduates might make. So here's a different frame of education, and one that I'd suggest is more inherently connected to intrinsic values. Thank you for listening.
Right. Thank you very much, Tom. That's fantastic, and I think this, well, both of the kind of diagrams you showed us are fascinating. That the seesaw, I think particularly as one thinks about that kind of progress that a student might make through, say, a degree program, it's very interesting for many of us, I'm sure, on the call who teach in universities to think about the practices that we engage in, how that kind of changes the angle of the seesaw. So anyway, thank you very much. So if you have questions that you'd like to address to Tom, please do use the Q&A and we'll pick those up in 20 or 25 minutes or so. I'm now going to move to Caroline Hickman, who is our second speaker. Caroline is a psychotherapist and a lecturer at the University of Bath. And I think it's particularly interesting, Caroline, that you've done quite a lot of work, including podcasts on eco-anxiety, which I know is something that has really come to the fore, certainly in the last couple of years or so, and in particular for younger people. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you, Stewart. So just need to warn people that I have a 13-year-old Labradoodle in the room with me who may cough or snore at any point throughout my talk. Please just ignore the noise. I'm not going to shut him in the kitchen. I'll just get the "what have I done wrong" face for the whole of the rest of the week. So, but just ignore the noise of a coughing dog behind me if you happen to hear it. He usually joins in. I feel like I've spent the last 5 years of my life exploring eco-anxiety, eco-distress, particularly amongst children and young people, but from an academic as well as a clinical perspective. So in my work at the University of Bath, for example, I've been teaching climate psychology to social work students, but also engineering students, because maybe I've worn the university down over the years, but they're now recognizing the importance of teaching climate psychology to engineering students, because they want engineering students to have this psychological humanist understanding for the future, to design sustainable solutions for the future. So my teaching work at the university is located there, but I've also been through the University of Bath researching children and young people's feelings about the climate and biodiversity crisis, but not just in the UK also. So I'm going to start by telling you what I've been doing, and then I'm going to go on to tell you what I've been finding. But this is with children and young people in the Maldives, in the United States of America, the UK, Brazil, Nigeria, Sweden, trying to get a very broad understanding, really, of how children and young people feel about this. When I started this research, there was very little research into the emotional response of children and young people. Most of the research had been done with adult participants. And in fact, at the time, it was kind of felt 5 years ago, haven't things changed really, that really it wasn't that relevant for children and young people, and that it was an adult concern. But I think we're all changing our perspective on that considerably now. I hope so, anyway. And then on the clinical side of my work, I'm a psychotherapist. I have a private practice, but I also do a lot of psychotherapy work and work with a group called the Climate Psychology Alliance. And this group's been in existence for 10 years to try and bring psychological understanding into conversations and narratives and research and writing and talking about the climate and biodiversity crisis, but doing it from this broad perspective, from the academic perspective, as well as from the activist perspective, as well as from the psychological perspective. And there's lots of work we've been doing. We've been trying to develop a climate crisis aware psychotherapy practice so that we can think about how psychotherapy, Chris Robertson talks about taking it outside of the consulting room, through the door of the consulting room, to try and move the profession to meet the changing emotional psychological needs of people as we move into this emergent time with the climate crisis. So we've been doing that sort of work. We've been doing a lot of work with teachers and schools. So I did research projects in primary schools with primary school children, just exploring how can we talk with young children about these existential threats and about these complicated threats like extinction without traumatizing them, without terrifying these children. So for example, with the local school here, we spent a few weeks, myself and some colleagues, talking to children and young people about whales, W-H-A-L-E-S, in order to open up a narrative, open up a conversation about the climate and biodiversity crisis. And we grew a crocus whale on their school playing field with 2,500 crocus bulbs planted into the shape of this whale, which then died back after a time, which allowed us to have the conversation with very young children about nature and about how things cycle and how things change and how they go away. So we've been exploring this in different ways with teachers about how to bring it into schools. And we've been working with the Primary Science Teachers Trust, teaching teachers about how to bring the emotional component alongside the science, because one of the problems with teaching children about climate change in schools is it's often done in science classes, and that divorces it from feelings, it divorces it from the emotional responsiveness. So what we've been trying to do is think about how to bring those things together. We also use models like climate cafes. Rebecca Nestor and the Climate Psychology Alliance has been developing climate cafes, where we bring groups of people together to talk with no agenda, without a professional agenda, to talk about how this feels. And this is bringing a psychological frame into the conversation, which is depth psychology. So this is very much looking under the surface of behavioral change into unconscious defenses, unconscious process, looking at what gets in the way, and that really we're not completely rational creatures as human beings. If we were, there would frankly be no war, there would be no child abuse, these things would not exist. There are other things that get in the way. So what we're trying to do is find pathways into that. And many of those pathways are quite imaginal, they're quite creative, they're narrative based and arts based and poetry based, because the language of the unconscious is inevitably quite located around the metaphor and around the image rather than factual. So that kind of frames what I've been doing. And I want to give a quote from one of the research participants who I spoke to before I started my research. I asked a lot of children, how do we talk to you about eco-anxiety? How do we talk to you about climate change without terrifying you? And I need to quote her because she's just perfect at this. So she said, you've got to tell us the truth about these things. She's 8, by the way. She said, you've got to tell us the truth about these things. She said, because if you don't tell us the truth, you're lying to us. She said, and if adults lie to us, then we can't trust you. She said, and if we can't trust you, she said, we can't tell you how we feel. She said, so tell us the truth about these things, even if they're scary. She said, but don't tell me all the bad things all at once. Tell me something bad, then tell me something good. Then tell me something bad, then tell me something good. And then she said, anyway, she said, I'm not a baby. So I love this child because I think she really encapsulates exactly the way we need to be building these conversations, particularly, well, with everyone, frankly, but especially with children and young people around these things. We need to have that emotional flexibility. So let me tell you a little bit about what I've been finding. So one of the early research projects I did was asking children and young people what they wanted from education to prepare them for the future. And apologies to any geography teachers out there, but a large number of children, funnily enough, said they did not want education on Oxbow Lakes. I do apologize if that's something that's really important to you. But what these children told me they wanted lessons in from school was how to grow vegetables, how to grow plants that we can eat, and how to detect which ones are poisonous. They wanted to know how to build boats. So they have this very practical focus. But then they moved off from that and they started talking differently to me. And they said they wanted to know how to have difficult conversations with parents and teachers about climate change, because they were researching climate change, they were online, they were exploring what it was, but their parents and teachers didn't know how to talk to them about it. So they wanted to know how to do that. They also wanted to have lessons in school, I think this would be revolutionary, in how to lobby politicians, because they felt that education needed to be tied into politics, needed to be tied into activism. And so they were very clear that they wanted to have that agency and empowering practice for themselves and not just depend on adults to do that for them. So I think that's amazing too. So I'm just going to give you a few more ideas about the findings that I've been getting, both from my research with children and young people, but also from my clinical practice. So I've been clinically as a psychotherapist, delivering a lot of workshops with youth activists around climate change, and also psychotherapy practice with individuals and families and groups. And I'm trying to use psychotherapy as a form of activism and not use psychotherapy and psychological thinking to pathologize the distress, the emotional distress that people may feel about the climate and biodiversity crisis, because we judge, we assess people's mental health and well-being based on their capacity to accurately respond to external factors, to what's going on, external reality. So as far as I'm concerned, to feel eco-anxiety, to feel distress is a sign of mental health, not mental illness. It is a sign of accurately emotionally responding to the external reality that we see around us today. Timothy Morton, the philosopher, thinks that maybe we were traumatized around climate and biodiversity crisis about 40 years ago. And we've suppressed this fear, and we pushed it into the unconscious, and we pushed it away, and we fantasized that technology would save us, or the government would save us, or someone would save us. And now this is an emergent anxiety which is coming back to the surface as we see the worsening situation in the world alongside the failure of people that we perceive to have power, their failure to act, because we declare a climate emergency and at the same time we continue to fail to act. So to summarize, I want to talk about some of the findings. The importance of focusing on education and psychotherapy, and it needs to be relational. So we need to build relationship with the people that we're working with. We need to teach science alongside feelings, alongside psychology. We can't just present facts and expect people to change. We've got to show them how to change relationally. We need to build emotional resilience and emotional intelligence around this. But we also need what I'm trying to frame as an emotional biodiversity. So we need, this is depth psychology. We need our depression. We need our grief. We need our loss. We need our rage. We need that in order to fuel emotionally sustainable activism. We cannot try and get away from these feelings. We should actually grow down into these feelings. And we need a balance between external activism and internal psychological activism. We need feelings and behavioral change. We must always bring climate and biodiversity crisis together. We need to link the systemic climate justice with global justice. A week last Monday, I had 5 psychotherapy clients. This was the day before the results of the American election were coming in. 3 adults, 2 children, 2 teenagers. The 3 adults did not talk about the American election at all, even though they were fully aware. Understandable, maybe they had other things they needed to talk about. The 2 teenagers did not want to talk about anything else. All they cared about was, will Joe Biden get in? What impact will this have on the environment? What impact will this have on, you know, our chances to deal with climate change? So what I'm increasingly seeing in clinical practice is a lot of young people are embodying on behalf of the rest of society, the rest of the population, extreme concern and anxiety and care and empathy and compassion around this in ways that they are struggling sometimes to defend against. They haven't got the adult defenses. They're finding it difficult to push this away. At its most extreme end, I'm working with young people who are suicidal and saying things to me like, why should I want to live in a world that doesn't care? The world does not care. So why would I want to live here? So they're embodying and internalizing this extreme distress. On the other end, we've got the ordinary anxiety, where a young person bursts into tears while washing up because, and this, I'm framing this as ordinary, I do apologize, but this is lesser in that what they're really upset there is the reminder of the plastic in the ocean. That isn't impacting on their daily life in quite the same way. But I want us to think about this on an emotional scale, that there is extreme distress being felt by young people increasingly. But just to say, it is absolutely a sign of the fact that these children and young people care, and they can't defend against this sense of care. One of the reasons they care so profoundly is we teach children and young people to care by teaching them about empathy and relationships, by buying them books with bunny rabbits in. We teach them about relationship. We teach them about love by teaching them about bunnies and rabbits and, you know, puppies and kittens. So they are completely connected in to not just the plight of humanity, but the plight of biodiversity, the plight of animals. And they care as much about the plight of animals and the voicelessness of animals as they do of people. So I'm going to finish with one more quote before you cut me off. This is quotes from children in the Maldives, because I also think globally there are different levels of distress. And this is a quote from children and young people in the Maldives who said that they see climate change as being like Thanos in the Avengers Endgame, whose ideology was to kill off half the population of the world so the other half could thrive. And these teenagers looked at me and they said, the trouble is, they said, we're the half being killed off. We're the half of the world that the rest of the world doesn't care about. We're being sacrificed and no one cares about us. Another child said, we watched online that people in Iceland had a funeral for a glacier. This was beautiful, they said, but who's going to have a funeral for us? We're going to be underwater soon. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Yes, that's so much to think about there. This is for the questions, obviously, but I'm beginning to draw connections between what you've talked about with the people that you work with in your, particularly your professional practice, and what Tom has been talking about in terms of what our kind of current education system does. And so I think I'd like to ask you later what the connections might be between those two. So but thank you for some really rich reflections on your practice and for sharing those quotations. So that was very inspiring and highly thought-provoking, so thank you. We're going to move to Robin Webster now, who is our third speaker tonight. Robin runs the Advocacy Communications Programme at Climate Outreach. I loved the bit in your biography that was online, Robin, where you, I'm going to get this right, you say you've been knocking around the environmental world for 20 years, but you've been doing so, of course, making lots of contributions as a journalist, as a researcher and a campaigner. So we're delighted to welcome you, looking forward to what you've got to say. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Robin.
Great, thank you so much. I am actually going to start by sharing my screen as I've got some slides. So fingers crossed that it all works. Could somebody give me a thumbs up to see that you can see that? And now we have a little bit of a think for a moment. So excellent, nice to meet you everybody, if only online. And I'm going to be talking for 10 or 15 minutes about crisis messaging, young people and climate change engagement. And as the introduction just said, I work for Climate Outreach. We're a charity based in Oxford, and we've been going 16 years now. And Climate Outreach aims to really provide a kind of bridge between the social science of climate change engagement and the people out there in the world who are trying their best to do the job. So I personally come from like a climate change campaign background. I worked for Friends of the Earth quite a while in my history, and my job now is to work with those advocates, with those campaigners who are trying to be effective climate change communicators and find ways of taking all that fascinating research that's out there to assist and support them as much as possible. And a big, we do this both as sort of providing actually do primary research, but we also provide training and support for advocates. And we also see ourselves as this kind of pulling together social science in a way that's kind of usable and applicable in different directions. So quite a lot of providing reports and advice and support for different. And part of the fundamental of the way that we think, the kind of underpinning ethos, and I feel like I'm probably going to give here probably slightly less expert summary of some work that our previous two speakers have talked about. But a part of our fundamental ethos is thinking we may think of ourselves, and we may have been taught by our society to try and think of ourselves as rational human beings who absorb facts and spit out rational answers, but we know that in reality that's not how we work. And people, we're story animals. We think in stories, and climate change, we understand climate change just as every other issue, as a socially constructive narrative, which is conveyed by trusted communicators in ways that reflect their identity and validates their values. So we're always thinking about these stories, what stories are we telling when we're trying to communicate about climate change, whether that be in an education setting or an advocate setting. And as Tom has talked about so eloquently, thinking about the values that people hold is such a fundamental and core way of thinking about how we actually going to communicate and get people to engage on climate change. So the way that I think about values as the things that matter us in our lives: kindness, beauty, friendship, success, etc. And Tom was talking about this difference in intrinsic values that are coming from within and extrinsic values that are more about our relationship with other people and how they can, to some extent, start to sort of compete with each other. And this core idea that effective communication happens from the values up rather than the numbers down. And this is something, of course, in the climate change world that we find ourselves sort of saying again and again, because it is an issue that's come from this highly technical scientific underpinning. And that has been where a lot of the communication has come from. And it's thinking about how do we not make this about facts and figures, but actually about the values, the narratives and identity of people in ways that they can actually engage with. And I apologise for a rather complex diagram here, but I just rather like it. It's always sort of told the story for me really well. This idea, the different ways to actually think about how effective communication works. And this kind of idea, this presentation on the left of the deficit model, the sort of expert idea that somehow someone up there, some godlike figure, will provide us with information and then we'll absorb it. And that's how people engage with climate change, with communications. We know that in reality, and we know from our lives, that that's not the way that it works. As members of a society, we are part of a hub. We're engaging with other stakeholders and other parts of society, and both the messages that come to us from governments, from corporations, from the environment that we work in, from our peers, affects us, and we also interact with and affect them. And I think starting to think about engagement in this kind of more network way, for me, is a really, really core part of thinking about climate change communications. And some of the core part of this is thinking that we're so fundamentally affected by the people around us, by the role of our peers, what they're doing, what they're talking about, the social norms, incredibly important in guiding people's behaviour. And I often find this personally quite encouraging if you're thinking about, why should I personally, bother trying to cycle instead of drive? It's such an insignificant thing in terms of actual numbers, but if you thinking about actually that's the things that we do are important not just to ourselves, but to actually the people around us, to our peers, so looking us to thinking about what actually is possible. And we see that across society, behaviours actually start to change and start to shift. Things start to shift when these social norms start to change, when people also see the social norms changing, but they also understand the reason to act. That understanding resonates with their own concerns and they feel they have the capacity to make the change. And if we're going to go through that fundamental difference between absorbing information about climate change and actually starting to respond to it, then all these criteria need to be effectively fulfilled. So what does this actually mean for young people? So just drawing on some research here, and I want to give a bit of a flag that some of this research is a little bit and I think Caroline's been working more recently with people, and I think we're going to soon be doing further research working with younger people across Europe, and we'll start to learn some more. So that's a bit of my rider on it, but I still think it's worth engaging with what we've got. So from a survey looking from 2015 found that 90% of young people across Europe aged 18 to 25 seeing climate change as a serious problem. I'm sure that 5 years later, that's now a higher figure. But what we're seeing is really a small percentage, only 5% engaged with environmental NGOs. And that's less than half of the amount that were engaged with sort of other sorts of community groups around them. So what you're seeing is this massive difference between younger people experiencing high levels of concern and awareness, but having lower levels of engagement, lower ability to actually be acting and responding to it. So, and it's also asking the question that, so are young people's perception of climate change fundamentally different from others in the society in which they're interacting? Again, flagging, this is slightly older research, but what this research found, this was from the UK, was that young people were expressing high levels of concern, but it wasn't always the top priority. And also expressing that sense of distance. In other words, this is happening now, but is this something that's always entirely relevant to my life? Is this something that's happening to me? Expressing lower levels of skepticism than the adults around them, but not always those high levels of knowledge, which perhaps isn't surprising. Younger people have had less time to absorb it. And also seeing that government has a primary responsibility for climate change. So part of what we're seeing here is actually younger people, unsurprisingly, also reflect the societies of which they're a part, and a stronger predictor of how they're going to think is often, what mum and dad thinks, what the people around them think. But this idea of government having primary responsibility for climate change is quite interesting when you look at the views of young people, because you're also seeing this disengagement from mainstream politics. So this quite a significant drop in the number of 18 to 24-year-olds voting in the UK general election, from nearly 3/4 to 42 in 1983 to 42% in 2010. And this reflecting like a skepticism about mainstream politics. And I'm just kind of speculating here, but what could this be about? A reflection of probably increasing job insecurity, living in an individualistic culture, and neoliberal ideology that kind of frames the individual rather than the society. And this greater move, which I think that the move to social media, of course, is a part of this pattern, towards more cause-orientated politics rather than the kind of more traditional voting politics. So this is some of the pattern seeing amongst young people's engagement. But absolutely core when we're thinking about the engagement of young people in climate change is this idea of efficacy, self-efficacy, which is the belief not only that it's possible to make meaningful change if you did something, but also that you personally have the ability to do something. You see lower levels of efficacy, unsurprisingly, amongst younger people who are more vulnerable to the patterns of society around them than in adults. And this is a really core part of a cause and effect of younger people being willing to engage, is having a sense of self-efficacy. As Caroline reflected in one of her quotes, having a belief is something that I as a young person can do. And if I do something, it's actually going to make a difference to the world. And this being a key determinant of young people's engagement with climate change. And this, I mean, this is not surprising, and it reflects what we see in other sorts of social science engagement, this idea of sort of crisis messaging, and there's some fascinating debates that were kicked off when Extinction Rebellion burst onto the scenes last year with its kind of very negative and shocking messaging, which actually I think it was a big surprise to a lot of climate change campaigners that it was as effective as it actually was, and people had to kind of rethink what they were thinking, because there'd been a lot of discussions about phrases like no doom and gloom. But actually what the social science shows us is that negative information, if you don't have a solution, if there's nothing you can actually do with that very negative information, is very overwhelming for people, and they're very likely to push it away. So if they just hear lots and lots of negative things about climate change, but don't have a sense of like, there's something I can do, and twinning that frightening information with somewhere to put it, some positive information about what you can do is a lot more motivating. In climate outreach last year, we did a piece of work where we encouraged people to go out into the world and have day-to-day conversations about climate change, and sort of looked at how you can have constructive day-to-day conversations about climate change. And one of the cool things that we found there was that the biggest reason why people around the world were unwilling to have conversations about climate change was saying, I don't know what to do about it. And one of the main reasons for which they were actually able to start doing something is if they were doing something, even if that something was, like cycling their kids to school rather than driving the car, like not a massive thing, but it gave them a framing, it gave them the ability, and it gave to actually start having a conversation about climate change, a way into it. So what the social science shows us is that authentic rather than contrived fear, as Caroline was talking about, being honest, being open about what climate change means, but combining that with a sense of constructive, real, not naive hope, and a sense of efficacy bringing both this negative and positive messaging together is an effective way of engaging on climate change. And I would argue particularly important for younger people who so need that sense of efficacy, so need a sense there's something they can do with this information. Finally, I mean, I did a piece of work earlier this year exploring the effects of COVID-19 on well, everything, but also on talking about climate change. And one of the interesting things that came out of that for me was thinking, I was talking to an academic, we were talking about this, and he was highlighting the idea of kind of collective efficacy. And actually, if you think about the way that the climate change debate has often been very individualistic. So those of us who were around in the 1990s remember all these like 10 top tips for how to reduce your carbon emissions and all that kind of stuff. Actually, that can be very isolating because you feel like they're all very individualistic. I don't feel like I'm part of something wider and bigger that matters. But actually what we have seen with COVID, though of course it's been highly politicized later in the year, is actions like wearing a mask, for example. You wear a mask not for your own benefit, but for the benefit of others, demonstrating this idea that you can take action together, you can create mutual support networks for a larger purpose. And to me, for all the politicization that's come out of some of those conversations, has really truly illustrated this idea of collective efficacy, this idea that a society can act together in response to a larger threat. And I really feel that that is should be a really core and fundamental part of how we talk about climate change. And I think this is often not clear in climate change communications, that this individual change has to be a part of systemic change, both for affecting our peers, the people around us, and also ultimately the actions of the government. It's all an interlinked web of which we are all a part. So I just highlight this report that I mentioned, the Communicating Climate Change During the COVID-19 Crisis, and I think that is the end of my slides. I will stop sharing. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Robin. I loved, I think it was the kind of first kind of diagram you showed us, which had the deficit model on the left. And actually, I think that's a really critical kind of thing for us to take away, because it's that movement from the left-hand side of the diagram to the right-hand side of the diagram, where you talked about these kind of networked connections and these associations between different kinds of knowledge, that is kind of really critical, I think. And then the two things, kind of the last two things you said, it's got to be collective and it's got to be systemic, which are two things we just don't do, because we tend to do things individually and we tend to do things piecemeal and in a reactive way. So thank you so much for kind of collecting a lot of practical examples from research that I think really gives us an insight to how we can begin to think about the way that we engage and that we communicate. So we are coming now to the point where we've got time for questions. People have been happily posting questions in the Q&A, which is fantastic. Again, if you've got questions for Robin specifically, please do type those in. We've kind of been liaising on the chat about the kinds of things that it would be useful to ask. I'd really like, if possible, to start with Tom. There's a question from Sarah about, can you give some more examples regarding the environment where the seesaw that you showed us might be affected? So are there some other examples that you've got about that, where that balance, if you like, could be shifted between extrinsic and intrinsic? So perhaps we could start with that.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. So absolutely. I mean, generally within the social surround, I don't know, Sarah, whether you had an educational context in mind or a broader kind of social context in mind, but generally, if you think about our immersion so frequently in the commercial environment, the predominant messaging we receive from mainstream media, the appeal to extrinsic values in so much political discourse, our exposure to commercial marketing, there's a very wide range of influences at a wider societal level that engage extrinsic values. I think specifically in an educational setting, I mean, I mentioned the way in which education was framed, or the purpose of an education was framed. But on the one side, an educational context which emphasizes competition and grading pressure and academic achievement is likely to be is more likely to engage values on the extrinsic side of that seesaw, whereas an educational context which celebrates creativity and self-direction, a community, connection to the wider world, to other people and the natural world, is more likely to engage intrinsic values. So I suppose what I was trying to convey here was an invitation for us to think about environmental education on a far broader canvas. It's not just about the content. It's not just about communicating on climate change. It's about it's about the contribution that education makes to our collective understanding about what's important in life.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Tom. And I think that's really helpful. It gives us a kind of broader framing of kind of what you're getting at with that kind of framework. So thanks for addressing that. This is something that I think has come up a couple of times in the questions. It's something I really want to know the answer to. Charlie asks, it's a question for Caroline. How can we equip teachers with the necessary skills to deal with the environment and climate emergency? And I suppose I wrote down in my notebook, which is how do we teach this kind of way of engaging with the environment? So I think we've got understandings about how we teach science, but how do we teach emotion? How do we connect with that? So I think that's been on quite a lot of people's minds in the chat. So over to you, Caroline.
Yeah, okay. Great question. So we ran a 2-day workshop with the Primary Science Teachers Trust, where we had educators, primary school teachers turning up from all over the UK. And we explored this with them. And what we were doing was, first of all, supporting those teachers in examining their own feelings about the climate and biodiversity crisis, because unless they were able to explore how they felt, they would really struggle to teach children in a way that would contain the children's feelings. Because what happens as soon as you start to teach these children these facts, their feelings start to erupt. And really it's about being able to contain and regulate children's feelings rather than suppress them or distance them or disallow them. And teachers wouldn't necessarily want to do that, but they needed to know how to make those part of the education experience. So it's about making that emotional response an educational experience and framing it that way so that they're not just allowed in the classroom, but they're part of the learning in the classroom. So we first of all got teachers to come to terms with how they felt about the climate and biodiversity crisis. Sorry, it wasn't quite as quick and simple as that. And then explored how children emotionally respond to trauma and to frightening facts and frightening figures. And then we explored creative ways to approach this. And again, this was coming back to the relational work. So for example, I would never go in and start talking to children about what they think or how they feel about climate change direct, because that's making it too personal, it's too direct, and it's just going to activate defenses and really scare children. So I do it sideways through their relationship with the natural world, with the environment, by engaging them to think about their relationship with whales, with koala bears, with polar bears, with trees, with animals, asking them, what's your favorite animal? And, you know, and then start thinking about how will climate change impact on that animal? And then you move to, and then how will climate change impact on people? So by the time you've got there, you've built up the child's emotional capacity to not just tolerate their own feelings, but to build up that narrative emotionally about how to talk about difficult things like climate change. So the child builds confidence as they go through. And that way they actually see those emotions as relevant to learning about climate change in the science, I hope I'm explaining it reasonably well. It needs to be relational. So the child needs to also understand the meaning of that for themselves, why it's relevant to be studying this for themselves, and then relate it to the local environment. But we then also were helping them to relate it to the global environment. How will children and young people, for example, be feeling if they live in Bangladesh, if they live in Nigeria, if they live in the Maldives? So you can personalize it and you can distance it, but that way the children use that imaginal bridge to think about feelings. So it's not splitting off the cognitive from the emotional. We need to actually do a sort of both and educational and emotional process. I hope I'm making sense.
Yeah, no, that's great. And
complex thing quite quickly.
No, I think the crucial thing that I'm taking away is that phrase imaginal bridge, which I think in that kind of idea of somehow trying to create empathy with others who we haven't met yet seems really critical. So no, thank you. That's a really helpful answer. I know we've got a number of people who are on the chat. Somebody who said, for example, that they're a trainee teacher, and I know what you've said is going to be really important to them. I want to pick up in the next question a related issue which has come in for you and Robin, and obviously Tom, if you'd like to comment as well. I'm going to go to Robin first. It's a question from Martin, who says, do you have any further insight on how to have these kinds of conversations with young people who aren't aware of climate change or who don't care about it, specifically in disadvantaged communities? Perhaps we could go to you first, Robin.
Yeah, thanks. And an interesting set of questions. I think there's two areas that might be able to draw on with this. One of them is just to give a bit of a flag. Actually, Climate Outreach has got some work coming out early next week, which we've been in which we've been involved in what you call a segmentation of the UK population. So not trying to get away from the sort of some of the simplistic kind of left-right ways of seeing how our society is separated out, and thinking about people's, for example, different parts of the community's reaction to authoritarianism, to regulation. And to give an example, like some of its civic pragmatists, for example, is the name of one of the audience segmentations, or backbone conservatives. And I think thinking about these different parts of our society and the different backgrounds that people have in this more nuanced way can also help us to kind of engage with more sympathy and climate change as a sort of an argument between progressive activists and people on the right. In terms of having conversations, we did some work last year on how to have constructive conversations about climate change. This is probably an area of work which is thinking for people who are that little bit older. But core part of that work, I think, is kind of encouraging people to listen to each other and to focus on connection with each other. There's a workshop exercise that I quite like to do, where you literally have one person has 5 minutes and the other person asks them a set of questions, which are essentially like, when did you start caring about climate change? What do you do about climate change now? How do you feel about that? And they just give the other person 5 minutes to speak about that without being sort of interrupted, actually sort of practicing some deep listening, and then you swap and you go the other way around. And when you actually do this, you often find that people come out with like really profound and interesting truths, just being given that chance to talk freely and openly about how they feel about something without feeling that they're being criticized. And so there's so much kind of blame and shame kind of embedded in the climate change conversation, a feeling that, if I'm from this particular perspective or this particular community, therefore I'm going to react to you in a certain way and you're not going to be interested in what I have to say. And activists have often focused a lot on kind of hammering out more and more information. And I think it's getting to that point of actually focusing on really respecting whoever it is that you're having that conversation with, focusing on listening to them, focusing on learning from them, focusing on forming the connection with them. So like actually that being like the primary way of having a good day-to-day conversation with somebody, whoever they are, and that being the starting off point for a really powerful conversation about climate change. perhaps that might be a slightly generic answer to your question, but I feel like it's such a kind of fundamental truth to actually just focus on that process of listening and connecting with somebody as a starting off point.
Great. So thanks for your perspective on that, Robin. So I'm going to ask Caroline if she'd respond to that now.
I will, but I'll give it a go. But I want to start by just sort of stepping back a sec and thinking, what is it we're trying to talk about here? And we are trying to talk about climate change, for which we psychologically do not have a blueprint. We do not know as humanity how to deal with this, because we've never encountered anything on this scale before. So this is this strange creature that we can barely imagine dealing with. This is one of the problems we've got. People try and equate it with things like the Cuban Missiles Crisis or world wars, but it's actually on a much bigger scale. So we need psychological imaginal leaps in order to imagine ourselves creatively into different ways to create bridges to understanding. And I think within that lies the possibility of challenging other structures psychologically that perhaps are not going to help us make these leaps at the moment. For example, the Western medical model framing that says depression and anxiety is a problem. You see, I'm reframing that and saying depression and anxiety is essential. So it really depends how you perceive these things. So I've already argued that anxiety and eco-anxiety, rather than being problematic, is actually holding the solution to how we engage with this. So I would also then connect that to things like talking with people about justice, global justice and individual justice, because a lot of the young people that I'm working with clearly identify with activism around climate change because of a general sense of unfairness and injustice. And there is profound understanding about that, for example, through the school strikers and Black Lives Matters. And those are part of this systemic global injustice of which climate change and biodiversity crisis is just one factor. So I think what I'm finding with young people is that they are helping to build this psychological understanding of the fact that we cannot just deal with one of these things. We've got to deal with all of these things to create sustainable change. And if we can reframe and question the Western medical model that says anxiety is a problem, then actually it allows us, it liberates us and actually says, well, actually, our depression is really useful. I think this is moving away from that binary either or position of either we're going to catastrophize and it'll be negative, or we've got to have hope, into a kind of radical hope. The Climate Psychology Alliance talks about radical hope, which is, you know, it's bad, things are tough, things are going to be very painful. It's already too late. If we went to zero carbon emissions tomorrow, it would be too late for the Maldives. It would be too late for Bangladesh. It would be too late for Vanuatu. And actually, globally, we need to connect with that sense of injustice, because these are the countries that haven't caused the carbon emissions, which have led to this mess in the first place. So actually, we need reparations psychotherapeutically. We need to say sorry to those communities. We need to budget, make room, pay them to preserve the rest of the environment that's already there, and actually not be afraid of these painful feelings around this and not frame them as negative. We should be hurting around this right now, because paradoxically, it's that distress and that hurt which could save us and help us navigate through this, because it's not going to be nice in the next few years. And I don't think we should be leaving children and young people to feel that distress on behalf of the rest of us. So I'm going to be an advocate for actually it's going to hurt and that's going to be all right. We need to learn to deal with that. Suffering has meaning and then it's all right.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Caroline, for your perspective on that. Tom, I don't know if there's anything you would like to add on this particular question. I was just thinking about the broader question of engaging those who may not be engaged within the context of education and, you know, the balance between the extrinsic and the intrinsic, but in particular, what it is we need to do in education that is different from what we are doing now. I don't know if there's any other comments you want to make.
There's just one thing I'd add briefly, I suppose, which isn't in any sense to depreciate the importance of communicating and educating on climate change, but I'd suggest that we're not going to step up to the challenge that climate change presents solely by working on climate change. Actually, proportionate responses to climate change are going to demand a deeper level of engagement with who we are, who we see ourselves as being. And there's immense opportunity to engage that in areas that are far beyond what we might formally think of as climate-related discourse. So to Martin's question, perhaps in working with communities for whom climate change seems to be a distant or non-urgent issue, there are many other areas of engagement which may foster a greater sense of agency, a greater commitment to civic participation, a strengthening of a sense of community, a deepened appreciation of the importance that our compatriots place on some of those intrinsic values. All of those things would contribute to a strengthening of public support for action on climate change without actually necessarily explicitly engaging climate change itself.
Yeah. So, and now that I asked about practices, and Lewis and Harry have been trying to summarize some of the many questions that we've had in the chat. There's a really interesting point that's been made, which is about the role of teachers and the fact that actually many teachers may also be feeling anxious and the word's been used here, scared about climate change, but actually they feel they have to remain detached. They feel they have to kind of assume that level of kind of objectivity. So the question is, should we and can we and how do we change that relationship? And can I start with you again, Tom, given that you started off by talking about kind of formal education and then perhaps come to Caroline and Robin?
Well, I guess my response would be that teachers would do well to feel emboldened to show their humanity, and that the semblance of objectivity is perhaps problematic. Maybe it's more helpful if this is speculative. It'd be lovely to hear Caroline's perspective on this, but I'm imagining it's more helpful if teachers feel emboldened to show the kind of human and tumultuous responses that they feel personally to those issues, rather than kind of maintaining what for many may be an artificial sense of objectivity.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. So Caroline, if I could hand over to you, thanks.
Yes, sure, absolutely. I think it's our duty and our responsibility. Duty is a horrible word, sorry. But I think as relatively speaking, inverted commas, grown-ups, it's our job to model what it's like to have an emotional intelligence around this and to be able to feel and connect with how this feels without either collapsing emotionally or having to go into denial and pretend that we're not having feelings, which is kind of what you're saying, Tom. I've spoken at a number of youth conferences, and the first time I did that recently, well, not recently, pre-COVID, I got up on stage and I looked at all these children and young people and I thought, you know, I actually need to speak differently. And the first thing that I wanted to say to them was, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry that we adults have kind of messed up. We're kind of not dealt with this soon enough, and you're left feeling distressed and anxious and concerned about this. And I start to stand here as an adult and say sorry. And now I have not personally caused all of these problems, but you also need to see an adult tolerate saying sorry, feeling guilty, feeling ashamed, saying sorry, moving to reparation, and then saying, all right, now what can we do about this together? Because showing young people how to make that emotional journey is one of the best ways in which we can support them. So we need to be honest with them, but we also need to show them how to speak about feelings and speak about emotion without collapsing or going, no, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. And we just need to do that relationally. And we can do that with a little bit of humor. We can absolutely share what it feels like. I sobbed after every single one of those research interviews in the Maldives. And I just told the children that they were having an impact on me, but I didn't cry all over them. So it's about using the feeling to enable that growth, that intelligent, emotional intelligent resilience and growth, and reassuring the children and giving them permission that it's okay to feel all of these things, that all of these feelings have their place, and that we can understand that. So as adults, we need to contain that. And that in turn gives them permission to feel. And that builds that, I think, builds that intergenerational understanding as opposed to intergenerational misunderstanding. A mother and daughter came to one of my public talks a couple of years ago, and they weren't speaking, and I think they'd forgotten what they weren't speaking about. Typical parent teenage stuff. And they talked all the way home. And they emailed me afterwards and said, you know, we just talked all the way home because we found this common ground, this common concern, and it actually healed something intergenerationally. The mother said, sorry, the daughter said, fine, now what are you going to do about this? And it gave them a way to talk to each other about this. So it actually strengthened their relationship rather than made it weaker. So I think we just have to have some courage.
Great, thank you very much. And Robin, do you have some thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, thanks. I think what it makes me think about is, as highlighted, I talked at the beginning of my talk about this fundamental principle in climate change communications of the trusted messenger, of the idea that we as people don't just listen to like clever words, we actually respond to the person that we're engaging with and speaking to. And some of the characteristics of a trusted messenger include authenticity, honesty, and understanding that somebody understands your values and understands who you are, and the sense that that person is being open with you. And I think we do, I mean, I am not an expert in education in any sense, but the kind of analogy that this makes me think of is the struggle that we've often seen scientists, and I think particularly at the moment young scientists, go through, where in the same way the kind of the ethics and principles of their profession is telling them to be objective, to be distant, to not express their emotions, and yet the work that they're discovering and what they're communicating is incredibly emotional to them. And how do you bridge that divide? And I can't give an advice to educators who when it's not an expertise that I have myself, but I feel like it's that proper communication comes from this sense of being someone who's trusted, of being honest, of being open, and that know as a human being that younger people have a finer sense than anyone else on earth when someone's not being honest and not being open and not being authentic with them. And I think that you get found out pretty quick, probably, if that's the case. So there's got to be that balance there, just as there is with other professions, just as there is with scientists, to maintain your authenticity and your authority and your responsibility of who you are as that individual, the thing, all that you hold as a teacher and as an educator, but also holding your humanity as an authentic and trusted person working with younger people, which is a difficult balance, I fully admit.
Yeah, absolutely. And so a connected question then, because we've been talking about perhaps the role of the teacher, the educator, and some of the boundaries that currently exist. There's a great question that someone has asked about what is the role of uncertainty? Is this a helpful concept? And how should we use it? How should we communicate it? And that seems to connect quite well with the role of the teacher. So I don't know, I know Climate Outreach have done a lot of work on obviously climate communication, and I'm sure uncertainty is featured a lot in that in relation to climate science. So I don't know, Robin, could I start with you again here and just say, what do you think the role of uncertainty is and how useful you think it is as a concept to try and engage people with?
Yeah, it's an interesting example, this, of, I guess, what I was talking about just now, about the difference between the way that scientists talk about the world and the differences between the way that the rest of the universe talks about the world. And I think this has been a fundamental problem in climate change communications, because the sort of words that when a scientist says uncertainty, they often mean something quite different from what we mean by uncertainty. A simple answer to this question is reframing uncertainty as risk, because uncertainty makes people think, oh, well, clearly you don't know, even if like actually 95% or 98% uncertain means virtual certainty from a scientific perspective. but talking about this in the context of like, what risk would you run as a human being if you're faced with a 95% chance of something happening, or if you're rolling a dice? That is a way of kind of just reformulating in people's heads how they engage with that very difficult issue. And I think a lot of this does come back to, I'm sure in an educational context, really profound conversations with younger people about what risk means to them, about how we manage that in our lives. And rather than seeing it as a kind of distant technical thing, seeing that as something that we know that we all engage with on a daily basis.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's great. Those are really helpful insights from the climate outreach perspective. Tom, could I ask you to comment on uncertainty?
I don't feel I have anything to add to what Robin said.
That's fine. No, that's great. Okay, because we've got some more questions, so that's fine. Caroline, is there anything you'd like to add to what Robin has said on uncertainty at all?
Yes, I'll give you a quick answer. I'm not known for quick answers. I would reframe uncertainty. It's absolutely essential. But we need to think about uncertainty as a radical, active uncertainty, a willingness to stand in the not knowing, which is not a passive, oh, well, we just don't know. And it's not ignorance. So it's that capacity to hold that tension between the desire to get back in control and depend on facts and figures. So it's that willingness to hold that tension, and this leads us into our vulnerability, which of course actually leads us into the remembering that we're human, and it brings us back to that capacity as humans to tolerate not knowing, and that way that opens up the possibility of discovering and creative opportunity. So uncertainty is very powerful, and we need to be able to stand in it and not allow it to be passed off as a kind of, oh, well, you just don't know, because actually it's a very powerful position to stand in.
Yeah, it's something that I'm involved with a lot. I teach a second year module, and uncertainty is something that we try to get to grips with a lot in that. And again, I co-teach that with a physical scientist, so the students kind of get exposed to these different interpretations of uncertainty. So in a minute, we're going to have one more question, which I will ask each panelist to comment on. It's just to say that Lewis has highlighted that there have been lots of comments, which hopefully we can perhaps follow up after this evening, about how do we actually bring teachers together, bring educators together, and perhaps the professions more broadly, to understand that teaching about climate change and environment isn't only to be siloed within geography and environmental science, which seems to be a really critical kind of area. But I want to move on to this last question that Lewis has put in the chat and highlighted to me, because this is a very practical question, and I know that each panelist will hopefully have some practical advice. And perhaps I'll start with Caroline, then go to Tom, and then to Robin. So Emily writes, I'm currently starting a small-scale social action project to engage small school groups with their community or school beyond education. It's mostly about developing outdoor spaces. Do you have any suggestions for resources or information, or I think we could add practices or methods to engage groups at a beginner level on linking social action and climate change activism? So how do we begin at the school level to link social action and climate change activism? Don't know if you've got any just immediate reactions, Caroline.
I'll make it very short.
Yeah.
I would really encourage any of these actions to engage children or adults' hearts. So I would encourage them to use instinct and to create things that they love, because I think healing that relationship between ourselves and the environment, ourselves and the natural world, is the first step in actually sustainable action here. So I would spend time talking to them about what do they love about the environment, and to trust that, follow that. It doesn't have to always be logical. So if they love dandelions, then you grow dandelions. I would also look at lovely, lovely groups like Heal Rewilding that've got lots of practical resources on their website and would happily share with you. And I would personally be getting all the children out there seed bombing every hedgerow in the area, and then enabling them to then walk around and watch that development and look at what does grow and what doesn't grow, and just be curious about that. Engage curiosity.
Okay, engage curiosity. That's something to tell our first year geographers to do. So that's great. Thanks, Caroline. Tom.
Yeah, I don't have any specific resources, but what I suppose my instinct would be similar to Caroline's in a way. And one opportunity that I have actually developed with kids at kind of late primary school, early secondary school, is an exploration of the value that we place on nature, and an exploration of the different ways in which we frame that. There's this very dominant narrative at the moment around the financialization of nature and the perception that we're only going to conserve nature or take a serious action if we can see that it's in our financial interest to do so. I feel that's dangerous and likely to erode the very basis of a long-term or more durable commitment to concern about what's happening to the natural world. And I think there's a real opportunity to explore with children different ways in which we relate to and value nature, and the implications of those, how that leaves them feeling, and how they map onto their own personal relationships with the natural world.
Great, thank you very much, Tom. And finally, Robin.
Thank you. Yes, I'm not sure how much I have to add to, because what Caroline said, it was so beautiful. One thing I would say is what she said was backed up by some research that we did some years ago when we looked across different political perspectives and looked at what would be the most successful messaging on climate change across a variety of audiences. And the one that came out of that was talk about what you love. That doesn't matter, it didn't matter where people were coming from. That was what they engaged with. And I think letting younger people talk about climate change, and we have this phenomenon in our society that we refer to as climate silence, like the idea almost that it's somehow sort of rude to start having a conversation about climate change. So giving them the chance to talk to each other, encourage them to talk to their mum and dad, encourage them to to break that silence. And also, as the one resource I could flag, I suppose, is our Talking Climate Handbook that we released at the end of last year, which was based on this idea of how do you have constructive conversations about climate change. Again, like the cool thing of this process of encouraging younger people to both respect each other and connect with each other in having these conversations and listening to each other about how they feel about it.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for, you had to deal with quite questions that you couldn't necessarily see because I've kind of tried to collate them together. So thank you for doing that so capably. I'm going to look at Harry and just ask if there are any things you would like to say, Harry, about where people can access the recording and any follow-up that it would be useful for people to know before I say a few thank yous.
Thanks a lot, Stuart. Yeah, so as we see, you've managed to bring together a lot of the questions, but we have had some amazing questions come through there. So thanks a lot for everyone's attention, for all the attendees as well, and all the really engaging questions there. So yes, as we mentioned earlier, there will be an email going out, which will have the link to the website, which will have the recording on there. There'll also have some resources from our speakers. And yeah, you can access the email addresses of each of the speakers on there. So if you did have some further burning issues, or you want to collaborate, or any sort of other things you'd like to share, there will be some email addresses and resources there on the web address, which will be sent out to your emails after this event. So yeah, I think that would be the best place to go to, and we can add more resources. And do feel free also to share resources if there are any attendees who feel there may be resources which will be you have in mind that'd be very useful for the rest of us, including our speakers and myself. Please do share those as well via the email addresses on the page. So yeah, thanks again for everyone, and thanks, Stuart.
Yeah, thank you. So I would just like to say a very big thank you again to our 3 contributors tonight who brought 3 different perspectives, and I think that's so crucial. But again, you can kind of hear from the responses from the questions that there's a lot of complementarity between them. I've just found it so inspiring because I've kind of learned things at a kind of conceptual level, and I've also learned things at a really practical level. I'd like to thank all of our speakers, and I know that there will be an opportunity to follow up. And Lewis has come back on screen at the right moment. As you can imagine, the kind of driving force behind this has been Harry and Lewis in their kind of organizational, promotional, and crucially technical expertise. So thank you, Lewis, for all that you've done to promote tonight, and in particular for feeding me the kind of summary questions, and also to Harry for all of your technical capabilities. It's gone very well. I hope everybody's been able to hear and see everything that they've needed to. Please keep an eye on the website that you were sent to, which contains information about the Education at a Time of Emergency project. As I've said, this is ongoing until the first half of 2022. We're just getting started. There was obviously a bit of a delay because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and keep in touch. So I think that's probably the moment that we can call tonight to a close. This is the point at which in a live session in a room we'd all clap, but I'm not going to clap, but you can think of me clapping because I'm so grateful to our 3 speakers, and to Lewis and Harry, and of course to everybody who has joined us tonight. So I hope you all stay safe and stay well, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Thanks a lot.